Good evening, y'all, and welcome to this very special presentation in bread theory. We'll have Comrade Cameron presenting a very special presentation about the Haitian Revolution for y'all. One of the most revolutionary events in Haitian and African history. So, without any further ado, let's toss it over to Cameron.
Sure. So yeah, it's Cameron, Prince he, him, and yeah, I'll talk to you guys about the Haitian Revolution. Took place from 1791 and ended with a man called Jean-Jacques Dessalines declaring Haiti's independence in 1804. It's a pretty important revolution. It's like the only successful slave revolution in the Americas, the largest one to ever exist, and it's the first slave society to achieve the permanent destruction of the slave system. Within a few years of this starting, these revolutionaries had gotten freedom for all the slaves in the French Empire, and Toussaint Louverture, the man who led the revolution, defended Haiti's freedom from the French, the British, and the Spanish, who are like these three most large and important military forces on the planet at the time. So obviously this is like an amazing and unthinkable achievement, and this revolution served as a beacon of hope that showed what could be accomplished by those who fought against slavery. And for those who defended slavery, it became this illustration of all the disastrous consequences of freedom. And when you look at study this revolution, you can see that none of the colonies in the Caribbean would accept any slaves from Haiti, just to scared that these ideas would spread and start revolutions in their own colonies. And this kind of explains a bit more like why it's kind of been largely ignored by history. It's this crucial moment for Black liberation historically, and I wouldn't really say it's unreasonable to say that the fight for Black liberation going on today is like a direct descendant of the Haitian Revolution. So first, I want to give like a bit of important context to the revolution. So the Haitian Revolution breaks out in 1791, lasts until 1804, and to give like context, the American Revolution ended in 1783. The French Revolution happened alongside the Haitian Revolution in 1799, and this French Revolution specifically plays an extremely important role in history. One thing I think is pretty important to clarify is the kind of class character of these revolutions, right? You could quite reasonably consider any sort of change to the social structure of a country, which is brought about by some sort of violence or revolution, and so it's important to consider the class that wins out the struggle. The American Revolution specifically is this pretty like reactionary revolution. It's not this national liberation movement, but the replacement of one apparatus of settler oppression, the British monarchy, is with another. And so first, I want to give some context to the relationship of Haiti to its European colonialism. I found this really nice audio clip. I hope it picks up in the thing of C.L.R. James reading the first paragraph of his book, The Black Jacobins. You guys should be able to hear it.
Christopher Columbus landed first in the New World at the island of San Salvador, and after praising God, inquired urgently for gold. The natives, Red Indians, were peaceable and friendly and directed him to Haiti, a large island, nearly as large as Ireland, rich, they said, in the yellow metal. He sailed to Haiti. One of his ships being wrecked, the Haitian Indians helped him so willingly that very little was lost, and of the articles which they brought on shore, not one was stolen. The Spaniards, the most advanced Europeans of their day, annexed the island, called it Hispaniola, and took the backward natives under their protection. They introduced Christianity, forced labor in mines, murder, rape, bloodhounds, strange diseases, and artificial famine by the destruction of cultivation to starve the rebellious. These and other requirements of the higher civilization reduced the native population from an estimated 500,000, perhaps 1 million, to 60,000 in 15 years.
Like Christopher Columbus, this evil person comes and he wipes the population out on this island, right? Like you can see at the bottom here, says it takes it from around 1 million to 60,000 in 15 years. So like using all these like crazy methods that they would normally use. So this period is also kind of characterized by this tense imperialist rivalry between the French, British, and the Spanish. And so this island Hispaniola here, like right next to Cuba and Jamaica. And In 1659, after like 30 years of fighting over the west side of the island, it was taken over by the French. And throughout the 1700s, you have this kind of increase in commodity production. And what the colonizers found out is that in the northern part of Saint Domingue, there's lots of flat land that's well watered with streams and sugar. And so they start producing sugar, and there's this massive increase in sugar production. And obviously, with the increase in sugar production came the increase of African slaves. And so at first, not all of the slaves were initially African. They would take people from France and tell them they would be granted freedom after a few years of work in the colony. However, sugar production is both capital and labor intensive, and so it caused the rise of African slaves and this brutal intensification of their labor in order to meet the endless demand for European sugar. And so in the 1790s, French Saint Domingue is the most lucrative colony in the world. I've got lots of stats here, but all of these rested on slavery. And this is how sugar became the most valuable commodity in the Atlantic, and how Saint Domingue got the nickname the Pearl of the Antilles. It's the wealthiest colony in the world, and all the other imperial powers want it for themselves. So now given that kind of context, I want to say who lives in this island. So there's kind of lots of different groups who inhabit this island: the whites, the free coloreds, and the slaves. And so I'll start off with the whites. So the whites are divided into two groups: the Grand Blanc and the Petit Blanc, as in the small whites and the big whites. The small whites are like these people who keep the island going day to day, like running, and these big whites are these kind of wealthy agents of the French bourgeoisie. They're the planters, and they're the dominant political and social force on the island. They own everything and everyone. One thing to notice as well is that the big whites don't want to stay in the colony. They want to make a fortune to sustain themselves, a life back in the metropole. And so over half of the plantations in the north of the island are owned by people who didn't live on the island and had never visited. There's also, in between these two groups, these kind of royal administrators who are sent by the French to kind of defend their interests. The population also has a significant number of free coloreds. These are often referred to as mulattoes. However, I'm not going to use that term because it racializes and simplifies the complex reality of the class on the island. And so instead, I'm going to say free coloreds. These free coloreds are the product of black and white parents, and it's pretty normal on the island for a white man and a black woman to get married and have children. So I guess a kind of trigger warning. There's also a lot of straight up kind of rape of slaves, right? And if it suited the white master, they had no problem with keeping both the mother and their own children in slavery. And over time, the population of them grew. And by the time of the revolution, the community of these free coloreds is almost equal to the population of the whites. These free coloreds amassed a considerable amount of wealth and property, including slaves. And before the 7-Year War in 1763, slavery was, to an extent, just kind of an economic condition and not a racial one. And since these freed coloreds would go themselves on to own slaves. So then there's also the slaves themselves. And so by the eve of the revolution in 1791, 90% of the population on this island is slaves. To contrast this with, say, the USA, in the US, the ratio of slaves to free white people is 1-to-1, like 50-50. And in Saint Domingue, this ratio is 10-to-1. So this isn't just a society with slaves, it's a slave society. I want to kind of briefly go over the life of a slave on the island. So, like, there are tons and tons of stories of slaves killing people who run the ships. And so, the same way the slaves feared the slave drivers, the reverse is also true. And so, this entire society is based on fear. And since these white planters are so overwhelmingly outnumbered, fear is the mechanism they employ to keep these slaves docile. And by using the most severe punishments, the logic is that these slaves would be too scared to try and gain their freedom. Normally, the books kind of discuss this in length for about a chapter, but I think we hear enough about the kind of horrors of slavery and all these creative punishments, so I keep it as brief as I can. But the mortality rate of a slave was over 50% within 3 to 5 years of landing on the island due to like overwork, disease, punishment. And the kind of economics these slave owners were using was basically you work the slaves as long as hard as you can until they die, and then you just buy new ones. So there's no sense in protecting their investment, since the price of a new slave is nothing in comparison to the massive amounts of value they generate from their labor. And then there's just frauds like the royal administrators. So there's kind of this kind of complicated web of tension. No one on this island likes each other. And so it's kind of useful to go over this. So first is the big whites versus the metropole. So the French had something called the exclusive with the colony, meaning that all the profit of Saint-Domingue has to go to France, that they can only trade with France. Obviously, they don't like this because it increases the price of their imports, and depresses the price of their exports, and it just means they make less money, especially since a massive proportion of the exports to France are just going to be re-exported somewhere else. So they're just being undercut. In addition to this, the colony is kind of under military rule, and so the reason they're like this is pretty obvious. Next, you have the big whites and the small whites. So to keep the big whites in check, the royal admin who governed the island tried their best to keep the big whites and the small whites in conflict. The royal administrators are eager to side with the small whites when they file disputes and things like that. And so the big whites, in turn, hate the small whites for cheating, stealing, and lying around drunk. And this particular tension is really important as the French Revolution gets going, since the small whites here will be just as eager as their French population to overthrow the big whites. So next you have the small whites and the free coloreds. These big whites want to get money so they can leave the island, but the free coloreds don't really have that interest. So they accumulate their wealth in the colony through land and slaves and things like that. And because they accumulate more and more land, it makes them more powerful. And the people who hate this most are these small whites. The one thing they have to cling to is their racial superiority, and they don't like the fact that their lives are so bad while these inferior ex-slaves have it so much nicer. The free coloreds, of course, didn't like the small whites, and they would call them Negro Blanc, as in the black whites. It's kind of a derogatory term. The big whites on the island realized that if the small whites and the free coloreds joined forces, they would have a problem. And so part of the policy was to catalyze any fighting between these two groups, so they don't realize how much of their class interests align. I'm sure you can kind of see some parallels to what media does today. And so around 1763, they start implementing actual racist things to limit the property that free colors could get and inconvenience their lives. They swore that they wouldn't give political rights to this kind of what they said was a bastard and degenerate race. You have then the free coloreds and the slaves, and the whites was the slaves. And so one of the reasons these racist laws they put into place was to stop any of the slaves thinking that they could also gain freedom. If they don't have these kind of racist myths to peddle and justify the existence of their colonialism, there's nothing stopping the slaves from realizing there's no difference between him and a freed slave, and then asking for their rights too. So in addition to this, the slaves and the free coloreds didn't like each other. The free coloreds, similar to the big whites, also treated the slaves as property, and the slaves knew that they weren't their brothers, they're just another class of master. One interesting thing here is that class isn't the only issue here. The racial hierarchy still exists, as the ruling class of society have to use it, as I said, to justify their colonialism. And so it's kind of similar to Franz Fanon's analysis in Wretched of the Earth. When you look at things through this colonial lens, class is not the only relevant thing. Fanon has this great quote where he says something like, you need to stretch your Marxist analysis when you deal with the colonial problem. Like, you're rich because you're white, and you're white because you're rich. And so similarly, you're enslaved because you're black, and you're black because you're enslaved. And so in this kind of classical Marxist analysis, I guess you have the economy determines the superstructure or the cultural sphere. And then in this understanding, it's the other way around, right? Like, gender, and Fanon says that this kind of analysis doesn't apply in the colonial context because it's based on a racial hierarchy and not the other way around. And so, for example, you have these kind of mulatto slaves who think that they're superior to a free black. You then have the slaves versus the big whites. And so everyone on this island, especially these people who make their money from it, is scared of a slave revolt. And so it's a common belief that, as I said, the only way to keep them docile is to keep them in constant fear. But the slaves, however, did resist a bit, like working intentionally slowly or things like that, or running away and poisoning their masters. And there were always these kind of free maroon communities around the mountains in the north. Now I want to talk more about the revolution, and I want to talk as little as I can about the French Revolution, but it's very much linked to the events of the Haitian Revolution if you want to properly understand it. It's as C.L.R. James said in his book, it was the conflict between the big whites and the monarchy and frogs that awoke the sleeping slaves. The one thing I can't really ignore going over is when the Bastille fell in 1798. After some pretty intense lobbying from free persons of color, the French monarchy after this they give this Declaration of Rights of Man, and so this starts off with something along the lines of all men are born equal and remain free and equal in rights. And so after the events of the fall of the Bastille, these royal administrators who had first exploited the tensions between the big and small whites had to leave the island. either that or get lynched. And so the big and whites and the small whites became this kind of unified bloc. So the big whites are happy that they can finally end the exclusive, and the small whites are salivating at the concept of redistributing property of the free colors. And so when the obvious question comes up of does this apply to the free colors and the slaves in the colony, they pretty much just kind of ignored it and just said, yeah, we'll answer this later. And this is so bad that even in the colony itself, the bourgeoisie stopped the sale of newspapers so that the slaves wouldn't find out about it. But obviously, you can't completely restrict information, and the slaves found out that these new badges that the officers were wearing stood for things like liberty and equality. Yeah, you have this document is kind of born of these French philosophers during the Enlightenment, right? You have this philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a man who had gone to influence Karl Marx, who would speak of slavery and freedom. But for them to be pro-colonization and pro-equality, the man that they spoke of that had free and equal rights had to be exclusively white, Western, and male. And so the French Revolution, almost like a decade later, would be gone to shape by this guy's ideas, pretty much more so than any other philosopher at the time. And so you come up with these kind of fundamental contradictions between the revolutionary developments in France and the developments in the colony. And despite the fact that the abolition of slavery is kind of the logical conclusion of all of these philosophies taken to their end, it didn't come from the French, but from the slaves themselves. And so you have this kind of rationalization of the slave trade, where you have to kind of dehumanize the blacks in the colonies. And that's why throughout the 1700s, you have this kind of rise of scientific racism. And so I guess now I'll go on to the very first rebellions. So after this is where the revolts start. Now, the revolution isn't just one big conflict between two parties. It's dynamic and complicated. And so it didn't really start off as one revolution, but three. So the one we're interested in, the slave revolution, and so I'll give some brief context to the others. So the first was a armed conflict by the free persons of color, and a rebellion led by this man, OJ. So these free persons of color were rebelling about what they believed to be their constitutional rights that they'd been given under this rights of man. And this rebellion was quickly put down. And the free colors all watched this guy, OJ, get tortured and beheaded. And now back at the metropole, the French don't like that the small and big whites are pretty much this, like they've teamed up. And so they look at these free colors to cause conflict. And so they give extremely limited political rights to the free colors of this colony. And although it applied to probably less than 5% of the black population, these small whites who wanted to seize their property, they were not happy. And so this kicks off a full-blown firestorm. And in retaliation to this, these free colors who want immediate application of this rights of man to their society take up arms. And so you have the small whites and these free colors having their own revolts. And so as this happens, these like 30,000 whites revolt against these 30,000 free colors. Some of these 500,000 slaves decided it was probably their time to organize too. And so throughout July and August of 1791, the slave leaders in all of the north of the plantations of the island begin to organize. And on August 14th, the slave leaders from every single plantation organized this meeting about 5 miles from the Cap, the main city. And so by this point, all the groundwork has been laid, and there was just a meeting to set a date. And the plan was for all the slaves throughout all of the plantations to rise up simultaneously and overthrow their masters. This immediately didn't go to plan. Some of the more hot-headed slave leaders tried to start a revolt days before the planned date, and they were just immediately captured. And then one of these slaves who was captured just snitched on the rest of them, and so that there was this massive, widespread conspiracy to plan this mass uprising in just a few days. In response to this, it seems that these white masters did nothing. They believed that the blacks on the island are too stupid, lazy, and incapable of a unified uprising. And so word spread through the slave community, and they gathered in secret to discuss what to do. And so in the history of the Haitian Revolution, this particular meeting, where I have these pictures on screen, is kind of the genesis of everything. And so this meeting takes the form of a voodoo ceremony. And voodoo is this kind of amalgamation of lots of different beliefs. It's very different to the Western representation of it. And it's when all these slaves are born all across different areas of Africa, this culture and this belief in voodoo allows them to unify and organize. And so when the revolution breaks out, it's meant to be at one of these ceremonies. And so this meeting was head by a voodoo priest called Bookman and a priestess called Fatima. Bookman was a slave who'd been exported from Jamaica for being a troublemaker and starting slave rebellions. And the story goes that he made this speech at the bottom here: "The God of the white people demands from them crimes. Our God asks for good deeds. But this God, who is so good, demands vengeance. He will direct our hands. He will aid us. Throw away the image of the God of the whites, who thirsts for our tears, and listen to the voice of liberty, which speaks in the hearts of all of us." I think it's such a cool quote. And so they removed the revolt of the slaves up until the next night. And then each slave gang, this person on the right is Bookman, this person on the left is Fatima, I mentioned before. And so each slave gang start murdering their masters and burning the plantations to the ground. Hundreds of slaves march from plantation to plantation, burning them all down, and they collect weapons and guns and kill any of the managers or slave drivers they come across. I think they spared like some doctors and priests, but most of them were just killed. And so nothing really defines this slave revolt more than fire. They burned everything, these plantation houses, the expensive industrial equipment, the sugar canes which are insanely flammable. They're destroying these material manifestations of their oppression, and they reduce the rich French bourgeoisie's like money-making stuff to ashes. And these slaves in their revolt went across the north. They get better armed, and so when actual battles are fought, they pretty much always won. And one thing is interesting is the way the slaves would fight is the same way they would fight back in their kind of tribal conflicts in Africa. They would set traps everywhere and send these small autonomous groups to ambush the whites. And one interesting is that it's the belief in voodoo that allowed them to fight so fearlessly, apparently, that they weren't afraid of death because they thought that when they died, they would be returned to Africa. And so you have these residents of the capital, the Cap, who at first couldn't believe what they were hearing. The refugees pour in, and they just start seeing smoke completely fill the horizon. So the whites are held up in this city, and they barricade all the roads and guard its border to defend against the slave insurrection. And apparently the smoke from all the burning plantations was so much that they couldn't distinguish night from day. And then in the Cap, while this is happening, they execute pretty much any slave within the city, and the small whites march around killing any free people of color they can find. And so we talked about Bookman before, so I'll talk about some of the other leaders. This guy here, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, he was probably one of the cruelest slave leaders. So being caught as a prisoner of a slave army is bad enough, but if it was this guy, it would mean torture and death without exception. He was happy to recreate for the fallen masters all of the cruel tortures that he had done to the slaves. And he would even decorate his camps with the heads of the whites. And because of this, he's a very effective fighter, and it was his army that captured this one town near the Spanish border that became critical to maintaining the revolution, since the Spanish, who don't like the French, are happy to supply the slaves with arms and resources. And so if you know anything about the Haitian Revolution, the one person you know is probably this guy, Toussaint Louverture. So Toussaint was a freed slave. There's this iconic photo on the front of the book, The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, and he's a very educated freed black. He had worked and bought his own freedom and then been educated in France. And his name wasn't always Louverture, before it was Toussaint Bretta. And then he changes his name to Louverture as the revolution gets going, which is French for the opening. And so Toussaint, as the revolution goes on, he slowly climbs up the ranks of the army and starts helping the slaves negotiate with the whites in the Cap. And so as this revolution goes on, they start needing more and more resources, and it kind of starts to slow down in 1794. There's lots of different conflicts that arrive within the slave armies. The leaders start fighting with each other. Some of them get killed, and as a reaction to this, Toussaint starts negotiating with the whites. His first demands were to let him and the rest of the slave leaders go free with some small reforms, and he would just sell out the rest of the army and return them to slavery. The whites in the Cap reject this proposal, thinking that the blacks are too stupid and weak that they could defeat them easily soon, and they were pretty certain that the metropole would send reinforcements. Toussaint's negotiations then get more and more desperate, until he's only asking for freedom for about 50 of the top leaders of the slave army. And whether this small group of leaders would have enough power to say to the rest of them, "Here are your chains, go back to slavery," is a pretty interesting thought. But as it happened, the white people were too short-sighted that they didn't give Toussaint the opportunity to try anyway. And so as a result of this, Toussaint completely dedicates himself to the complete emancipation of the slaves. And he writes this letter and sends it around the world in 1793, where he says he wants complete liberty, equality, and that if the slaves of the island want that, then he should be the one that they follow for it. This letter, though, wasn't really aimed at the slaves, but he was particularly focused on the Spanish and the British. Both of these imperial powers want to take this wealthy colony from the French, and so the Spanish, who control the neighboring colony, would provide guns and ammunition to the slave army. And so the white planters on the island in the coming months were almost finished, and so they invite the British onto the island to help put down the slave rebellion. And so at this point on the island, you have the Spanish, the British, and the French all fighting for control of this small island colony. So now back in France, you have the French Revolution complete, and the French have done what they've done all their infamous stuff where they execute their royalty. And so the people who are in the French government now, there's this republic that constantly speaks of democracy. And so from the point of view of the French government, the white slave owners have deserted France and gone over to the British. And so as far as they're concerned, the true Republicans in Saint-Domingue are the enslaved who just want their freedom. And they endorsed the emancipation of these slaves under the condition that they joined them against the British. And if you kind of consider this from the slaves' point of view, it makes sense, right? The British have their monarchy, the Spanish have their monarchy, and the French, on the other hand, have this republic that speaks of freedom and liberty and equality. And so Toussaint and his commander, Dessalines, quickly changed sides, and like that, slavery was abolished, not just in Saint-Domingue, but across all the French colonies. And they become French citizens, which I guess apparently is a good thing. And so after these years of opposition, Toussaint becomes loyal to the French Republic, and it completely shifts the balance. And so the freedom of all these slaves only happened because of these brave revolutionaries in Haiti. So the Spanish and the British were both expelled from the island, and Toussaint becomes this like dominant political force on the island. I don't want to make this sound like this great person of history narrative, but on all accounts, he's like a genius. He personally negotiates the withdrawal of the British and the Spanish, this person who was once a slave. But he does have his issues, and as CLR James says, Toussaint didn't make the revolution made Toussaint. And so one of the problems with Toussaint, and one of the main points of conflict, is that Toussaint decided to keep the economy of the island afloat, so he had to reinstitute these sugar plantations using really coerced wage labor, which brings him into conflict with these kind of ex-slave revolutionaries who obviously don't want to go back to doing work in the sugar plantation. And this really weakens Toussaint's position. By the time he writes a constitution in 1801, his popularity is really weakening, and he's using some of his commanders as things like drivers on the plantation. There's even this one guy who's Toussaint's adopted nephew, and he rebels against these conditions, and then in early 1801, Toussaint just has him executed. But in Toussaint's defense, he's in an extremely difficult place. He has to generate income and resources to defend the colony and preserve liberty, and so he has to extract value and resources, but this problem is that it's generated from exploitation, but he just thinks this is the best way to go about it. And in addition to this, Toussaint is also a devout Catholic, and so he makes voodoo completely illegal. I can't really see the justification behind this, considering how much of a massive role it played in the initial revolution, but anyway. And so you then have Napoleon Bonaparte and Toussaint. So back in France, you now have the rise of Napoleon, and Napoleon during this time, he has this famous movement where he overthrows the government and says something like, "The revolution is over, I am the revolution." And so then Napoleon writes a new constitution for France. And he writes this constitution that threatens to basically reinstitute slavery. As a response to Toussaint writes his own constitution and says that slavery will never exist in the colony ever again. And it's the first country to ever completely outlaw racial discrimination. But one thing bad about this constitution is that it appoints Toussaint as sole leader of the country for life. And so this is enough to make Napoleon react. And he decides that Toussaint must be removed. And so Toussaint would then see the biggest French expeditionary force ever assembled. And Napoleon sends his brother-in-law, Leclerc, to run things. And they more or less conquer the island without conquering it. And by that, I mean they want to demonstrate this massive, overwhelming military force to stop any form of rebellion. And Toussaint attempts to fight them for 3 months, but the population's kind of lost hope in him. His main commanders have left him. Dessalines goes over to the French, and so he loses. And most of the French there have the idea that most of the slaves have the idea that the French are just there to take Toussaint, and they don't want to reinstitute slavery. And so in the book, The Black Jacobins, there's really interesting series of letters of Leclerc writing to Napoleon, telling him, like, please don't reinstitute slavery or I'll lose all the support I have here. And then on May 6th, Toussaint surrenders to Napoleon, and he's sent to this mountain prison where he dies. He starves to death in 1803. I'll talk about this more in general afterwards, but I want to give some context to the Haitian Revolution. And so one of the things that you really get from Leclerc's letters is the role that women play. And so these women are doing a lot of the frontline fighting. And one thing you can really get is that the French would single out the women as being the most brutal and ruthless fighters, as the ones who exerted these most dramatic revenges against the French. And I think it's really interesting how even in this kind of revolutionary history, the women are almost like written out, right? Like it takes like a lot of time to kind of like find examples of women participating in this revolution. But as you see here, the women made up a third of the slave population, that accounted for 35% of the Revolutionary Army. So they were doing more than just participating. After this, you have this kind of war of independence. So apparently, as Toussaint stepped on the boat to go back to France, he said something. He said, "In overthrowing me, you have cut down in Saint Domingo only the trunk of the tree of liberty. It will spring up again by the roots, for they are numerous and deep." And so it kind of goes back to what C.L.R. James says, where he says, Toussaint didn't make the revolution makes Toussaint. And so you have this really interesting series of letters, and at first he's getting super excited about, from Leclerc to Napoleon, where at first getting super excited about capturing Toussaint, and he's boasting about how he has all his previous officers under his command. But then news arrives from one of the colonies that Napoleon has restored slavery in another French colony, despite Leclerc warning him not to. And so now these leaders who have defected from Toussaint to go to the French have now completely defected again to start the fight against Leclerc and his French army. And at this point, the army is completely destroyed. You can see from the letters again that Leclerc starts getting really desperate, and he also catches yellow fever. And now once this happens and Leclerc gets more sick, he starts something which he calls a war of extermination. And he says in a letter to Napoleon that he should kill all the blacks over the age of 12 and get new ones, the ones that know nothing of liberty and equality. And so the violence and destruction of this last war just increases exponentially. Like the slaves will do something, and then the French will retaliate, and then it just gets worse and worse. And now you have Dessalines, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the person who is leading this war against Napoleon. And so to win this war, him and the rest of the slaves decide the best way is to burn everything, to reduce all of San Domingo to ashes, so the French don't even want to be there in the first place. And it works, and by 1803, they write up a Declaration of Independence, which is modeled on the US one. And there's a story that Dessalines, he writes one draft, and then another one of the leaders says something like, no, this isn't hardcore enough. And then it's like one of my favorite quotes. He says, for our Declaration of Independence, we should have the skin of a white man for parchment, his skull as an inkwell, and his blood for ink, and a bayonet for a pen. And so they announced the change in the name. It's no longer Saint-Domingue, it's Haiti, which is the name given to it by its original indigenous inhabitants. And the declaration is super cool because not only do they negate just the French Empire and colonialism, but all European empires and colonialism. The entire Haitian Declaration of Independence is so cool. I would really recommend reading it. It's like 500 words. It's not really that much, but the rest of 1804 is really infamous in the history of the Haitian Revolution because Dessalines fears that the French whites are plotting conspiracies to overthrow him. And so he pretty much massacres all the white French remaining on the island. Some people, they really try and kind of racialize this issue and say that they just killed all the white people, but it was specifically the French, right? Like they didn't kill any of the Americans or British, and they were heavily coerced to do this by the Americans and British in the first place because they want to kind of isolate this island from the rest of them. But in the end, about 1,000 to 2,000 whites completely wiped out. And so that's kind of the history of it up until 1804. And so I wanted to touch on like the importance of it and why it's never talked about in the first place, and so how it's kind of been sidelined from history. So first is kind of why it's never talked about. So this revolution, it's unthinkable as it happens, right? If any of you guys are familiar with this book by Albert Memmi called The Colonizer and the Colonized, he has this really amazing analysis about the psychology of colonialism. And he says that, like, for the colonizer to accept his role, they have to accept that their position of power is illegitimate. And so the only way to enjoy his position is to kind of absolve themselves from the guilt. And so that's why they falsify history, create racist mythology and science, rewrite laws, and attempt to whitewash their legacy. And so throughout the 1700s, you have this rise in scientific racism that I talked about before. And they had to kind of categorize the blacks as this other species. So even before the Haitian Revolution, slave revolts did happen, but they're largely ignored. Just acknowledging them means acknowledging the humanity of these enslaved. And so the Europeans at the time of the Enlightenment, who speak of freedom, equality, etc., have to grapple with the fact that as they discuss this, there's this contradiction with the fact that they want to keep their colonies. And so you have this anti-black racism at the very center of the ideology of the planters in Haiti, which is born of these kind of constant contradictions between what liberals write about and what they do. And so at the time, the framework of Western thought made it something completely unthinkable. So what you have is, when the revolution breaks out in 1791, a member of the French abolitionists who called themselves the Friend of the Negro, he says something along the lines of, anyone who knows the blacks must realize it's simply impossible for 50,000 of them to get together so fast, because slaves could not conceive a rebellion on their own, and mulattoes or whites are not so insane to incite them. And so they just believed that the news had to be false. And so it kind of makes sense that this racism meant that they couldn't understand it as it was going on, let alone write about it after the fact. The second reason is that it kind of challenges these ideas that Europe tells itself. It's kind of born of this same thinking. The West likes to credit its power to the rise of liberal democracies, but we know this isn't the reality, and they obtain their wealth through exploitation, murder, imperialism, colonialism, slavery, and then what they say is lies. It's similar to what Rodney says in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. The development of Europe relies on the underdevelopment of like Africa and these other colonies, right? And so if they want to explore these mass uprisings, not only do you have to acknowledge the humanity of black people, but you have to acknowledge the contradictions that cause these kind of uprisings in the first place. It's built into any system. You have this tendency to kind of proclaim its normalcy. And so to acknowledge resistances and revolutions is to acknowledge that there's something fundamentally wrong with the system of slavery, which itself is this function of capitalism. And so how does this kind of thing manifest itself? Like how do they avoid talking about it? Well, first off is they just straight up ignore it. The first way people typically get around talking about the Haitian Revolution is just ignoring it. And there's kind of a greater trend of the West ignoring its colonial past for the reasons I said before. But the Haitian Revolution had this great significance, not just for Haiti, but for Europe too. France lost 19 generals in the battle, and much more French died in Saint-Domingue than the entire Battle of Waterloo with England. And England also lost more men than in the entire Battle of Waterloo with France. It's also the Haitian Revolution which inspired the Louisiana Purchase. And as I said before, Saint-Domingue is the most profitable colony in the world, and at this point you would think that these strings of facts will at least trigger a kind of mention in the hundreds of books of French and revolutionary history. For example, there's this one book titled The Age of Revolution, 1789 to 1848, and there's not a single mention of Haiti or any of its history. And this isn't just of some absence of mind, it's almost this conscious attempt to keep this out of history books. And so when they can't avoid mentioning it, they go to things like outside agitator narratives. Like they're so common even now, but back then politicians looked to blame literally anything other than the black slaves themselves rising up. There's the Spanish, the British, and the Polish even were all pointing fingers at each other as to who allowed this to happen. And as I said before, doing this is just a way of avoiding confronting the broken white supremacist system. And whether intentionally or not, they're making a statement about blackness. They can't recognize blackness the same as whiteness, because they don't have the framework to analyze black people envisioning their own freedom and organizing for it. They believe that it has to be some sort of outside agitator, and they're making a statement about the ability of black people to do the same thing that white Europeans did in France and America. And you can see this kind of thing even now, when there's BLM protests, the first thing you hear is this Antifa, Antifa, because the system delegitimizes itself if they recognize that it's regular people who are organizing this kind of systematic change. And so the third way is trivialized. So as I said before, they want to do everything they can to avoid confronting these contradictions in their system. And so they focus on saying things like it was a revolt or a rebellion to underplay the severity of underplay the severity. And so they don't want to say the word revolution as they do for France or America, since doing so would acknowledge that these black slaves are able to do what they can to envision their freedom and organize against this function of capitalism. That's pretty much it. I kind of had like some talking points. If anyone was like interested or wants to ask any questions or like contribute anything.
Thank you, Comrade, for this awesome presentation. This was extremely informative. So, how did the Haitian Revolution come to be such a pivotal part of your understanding about imperialism and the importance of decolonization and understanding the history of it from an African perspective?
Sure. So I think I first kind of came across it when I was reading Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson, and he talks about it, and I was confused how if it had this kind of like it's got this massive impact, how I'd like, not heard of it at all. And so I decided to then read the C.L.R. James book, The Black Jacobins, and I just think it's the most amazing piece of history. Like, I just don't think there's any. It's the most kind of like revolutionary revolution that many people haven't really heard about, and I just think that like there's so many lessons you can kind of take from this that translate like so effortlessly to through time.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really good shit. Would you say you feel like the Haitian Revolution is definitely intentionally not taught to us? It's the kind of history they don't want us knowing about, would you say?
Yeah, for sure. Like, so for example, here in the UK, right, when there's kind of all these movements to introduce like the kind of colonization history into like our curriculum, right? They say the government says things like we don't want to teach people things that go against quote British values, right? So it's not just that it's just of some kind of absence of mind that they just happen not to talk about it and it's just forgotten about. Even from when the French Revolution first happened, you can see like the French at the time would do like everything they could to not put it in the newspapers and things like that. And obviously, like there's still like records and things like that, but it's not just kind of accidental that it's not taught about. It's a kind of conscious effort to keep things and just kind of the greater colonial history of the Western powers out of just like schools and everything like that.
Right. That makes total sense. I didn't even realize that there was a conscious effort to keep reporting about it from the newspapers because, they have to understand that if people start to see what happened in the Haitian Revolution and how they were able to fight to get the boot up over their neck, that might ring out and others might want to try it. And even indeed, at the time, others did rise up in response to the successful Haitian Revolution and to fight for themselves. So that's good shit you shared. So what are any last thoughts before we wrap up that you wanted to share with us, Comrade?
If anyone wants to say anything about these things, where they don't, I had like just this like kind of thing here because like I think this revolution is like extremely complicated and nuanced. So I just kind of have some resources here if anyone wants to learn anything more about it. I think that like it's really, really worth learning about. Even just like if you learn a bit about it, because there's so much other things that I missed out. Just because fitting it into like a kind of 1 hour presentation would just be insane. So I think it's the Cool Piece of History. The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James is definitely the best book to read on it, and especially since he gives like a really nice Marxist analysis, and he kind of links it to the Cuban Revolution at the end as well. How these two things are directly linked.
Wow, that's really good. We're gonna maybe that'll be a good thing to read in the Bread Theory at some point on our Monday sessions where we're doing different works from Black and Brown and Indigenous comrades. So I appreciate the recommendation. And then you said you also recommended Black Marxism as well, huh?
Yeah. Black Marxism is a great book. That whole book is fantastic.
Awesome. Well, appreciate it, Comrade. The presentation was awesome. We can't wait to get it up on the Bread Theory YouTube. We're going to go ahead and wrap up, y'all. Thank y'all for showing up. Solidarity, always, comrades. Y'all take care.